my friends are simps.
I am always on the lookout for weird and wonderful alternative input devices that help you to approach making music a bit differently. And a few months back, I came across the X-Key or X-Key from Intuitive Instruments. This is an expressive MIDI and CV controller which has got some especially interesting features which piqued my curiosity. Now, Intuitive Instruments seem to be a pretty small independent company from France. They've got a history of creating unusual devices with a focus on musical theory and basic composition. The fact that they are French means that I'm deliberately pronouncing this X-Key or X-Key, I guess, rather than X-Quists. But I genuinely don't really know which is correct, not least because I didn't pay very much attention in French in high school. So I apologise in advance for my cultural faux pas, especially as France and Scotland historically made up the Auld Alliance against the English oppressors. So I am ashamed, but you can blame wee Dougie who used to fire rubbers at people's heads and the general chaos of going to school in a small kind of satellite part of Glasgow. Either way, this controller in particular caught my eye for a variety of reasons that we'll get into, and after a bit of a chat with them, Intuitive Instruments agreed to send me one over to try out. This is a promotional unit for the purposes of this review and feature video, but I did pay the fairly significant customs and import taxes, etc. myself, thanks to the consequences of Brexit. Now, I've been using X-Key for quite a while now, but version 2.0 of the firmware was slated for the end of December 2024, and this added a bunch of features as well as made some significant improvements to areas that I had given feedback on, so I wanted to hold off to make sure that this video reflected those changes and additions. Now that I've had some time to play about with the updated firmware, I can fairly confidently give you some of my thoughts at this stage. In terms of the build, X-Key comes with a plastic enclosure with options to add either wooden, cork or aluminium trims as part of the deluxe edition. And as you can see, I went with a rather fetching blue colour with the aluminium trims. As well as the 61 hexagonal pads on there, there's also a bunch of function buttons and a 6-zone touch slider which is used for the built-in arpeggiator. On top of this, we've got 4 smooth endless encoders which have got corresponding LED indicators and which are also clickable for secondary functions. Overall, this feels nicely put together and everything is responsive in the way that you would expect, although the plastic construction can feel a wee bit lightweight, especially or including with the encoder covers. So for that reason, I would definitely recommend getting the deluxe version, as I think the aluminium edges help increase the overall sturdiness of the thing. On one side of the unit, we've got a variety of different possibilities for connectivity. This includes USB-C for power and MIDI, although you can also use mini jack MIDI input and output, and there's also CV outputs for pitch, gate and modulation, which are all on mini jack connectors, as you might expect. Now, this is actually one of the main factors that drew me into X-Key in the first place, because it allows you to use the controller directly with hardware synthesizers, drum machines and other bits of gear like modular systems without requiring any additional conversion boxes. This is still a fairly unusual feature in the controller world, many of which are just USB MIDI alone, and so this is a major plus from my perspective. Another unexpected bonus comes in the form of the inclusion of a Kensington Nano lock slot, so you can secure the controller in place to a table or a desktop or whatever else, and this is just a neat wee detail that I quite appreciate. The most obviously striking thing about X-Key when you first look at it is its hexagonal layout, based on or at least related to the concept of a harmonic table. This is an alternative approach to the standard piano style layout that we're all familiar with, where sonically complementary notes are found next to one another. Perhaps unexpectedly, X-Key has been designed to be used vertically rather than horizontally. And whilst you can, of course, position it horizontally if you want to, it does mean that the labels and displays will be the wrong way round. However, when viewed correctly, semitones are arranged on the horizontal axis. Because of this isomorphic layout, chords can be formed with simple shapes that move up and down the board vertically without changing, including minor and major thirds. Naturally, you can change the octave as well as transpose the displayed scale in real time. And on here, you can also select from a variety of different scales and root or tonic notes, which are then represented on the hexagonal pads with LEDs. This makes it much easier to not just stay in key, but also understand the musical relationship between the different notes. It is worth noting that whilst the default layout may appear similar to other instruments like an accordion, the particular arrangement of X key is apparently distinct, but you can also create and store up to 8 custom note layouts and 32 custom scales using the desktop configuration app. In practice, this means that you're able to not only program your own weirdo scales, but you can also change the relationship between the different pads. This allows for alternative isomorphic layouts, or you can go wild and completely program custom layouts with custom colors and notes in order to control things like drum machines or other specific samplers. The encoders and some of the buttons transmit MIDI CC values, and these can also be adjusted now within the app. This level of customization was just added in version 2.0 of the firmware based on user feedback, and it makes a really big difference, opening up the possibilities and the general usability of the controller significantly. I can imagine creating alternative layouts specific for things like triggering different scenes with my Sleepy Circuits video synth, for example. One thing that I would like to see adjusted in future is to have some kind of graphical representation of the knobs and the buttons specifically within the app, as currently when changing the MIDI CC values for those, they are just described as encoder 1, encoder 2, etc. And that can be a wee bit confusing. So it should be fairly straightforward to change that, maybe in 2.1. The controller has got support for both MPE and Polyphonic Aftertouch. This means that in addition to just triggering notes with different velocities with the pads, you can also shift and modulate the sound by using different types of movement. For example, associating the cutoff of a filter to how much pressure you use, or a pitch bend to how much you roll your fingers, as it were, similar in a way to playing a guitar. MPE requires compatible instruments like the Hydrasynth from ASM or the Dreadbox MPE, and is something that you will find support for from other alternative controllers like the Roly Seaboard or Linstrument. There is a global control accessible from the X key itself for trigger sensitivity adjustment, but within the app you can also change the sensitivity curves for different parameters, which gives you a fair bit more granular control. These types of devices live or die based on how natural they are to operate and how easy it is to adjust the sensitivity, and whilst that is all quite subjective, my experience anyway has been pretty good. I haven't really had any problems with the sensitivity or been able to adjust it. I haven't really had missed notes or anything else like that. So there's the basic built-in arpeggiator here, which allows you to select from various pre-programmed patterns, which also retain the ability to modulate parameters with MPE whilst it is engaged. The arpeggiator can be triggered in a momentary fashion or locked, and it syncs either to an internal tempo or to MIDI clock. However, bizarrely, there doesn't appear to be any way to engage a hold for the notes. You have to kind of keep the note pressed in order to have the arpeggiation, which is a bit of a shame. That would surely be straightforward to add via firmware update as well, so perhaps we'll see that in future. As a standalone MIDI controller, I really, really like X Key. The squishy pads are incredibly satisfying to touch, kind of like sticking your fingers into a bag of Haribo or something like that, but they're also practical. Whilst I am not the most skilled MPE player in the world, I've found that they feel much more naturally expressive than even something like the much more expensive Linstrument with its static rubber pads. However, the design does mean that you can't really slide between pads in the same way, so there is something of a trade-off there. Another major plus for the X Key from my perspective is that most, if not all of the key values and parameters, such as the MIDI channel, pad sensitivity, etc., can all be adjusted via the device itself. And this means that you aren't relying on the app or, you know, at the mercy of software updates to do basic things. And this might seem like a really kind of issue, but it's something that is really important for the long-term independent longevity of a device, and also one that manufacturers often completely overlook or take for granted. So I think that's a big positive. Finally, one unexpected benefit has been that the layout of the pads has made me more aware and more thoughtful of the relationships between notes and chords in a way that I hadn't quite considered before, and that surely is a positive thing as well. X Key has got an accompanying desktop app which is available currently for Mac and Windows. Support for iOS, Android and Linux is apparently in the works, but not, I don't believe anyway, supported at the time that I recorded this video. The app has had a complete overhaul in version 2, and as I've noted, includes a lot of really useful configuration options for creating custom layouts, scales, and also assigning MIDI note values to the knobs and buttons. However, there are also a number of compositional features baked into X Key, which currently rely on the app. These include the ability to record different virtual instrument loops, which can then be arranged and triggered using scenes or snapshots, as they call them. And this allows you to load up VSTs in the app and create basic songs, as well as then play over the top of those loops in key with the harmonic layout. Now, I appreciate the idea behind the app, and I can see how it would be useful for folks that are just getting into music composition in particular. Given the history of Intuitive Instruments' other devices, I can see why they've gone down this route. However, I have to say that I personally can't imagine myself ever using the app for actual song creation. For a start, there isn't really any DAW integration as far as I can tell, even just for recording, which makes this more of a performance tool. And for those purposes, if you're tied to a laptop anyway, then something like Ableton Live with a dedicated controller is going to be much more capable. I have heard that compatibility with Ableton to trigger loops and clips directly from the pads is something that is in progress, and if they get that right, it could be pretty cool. However, whilst that would be a nice bonus to have, from my perspective, the standalone features of X Key are what make it especially interesting, and probably what are worth focusing more time and development on. Overall, if we consider X Key solely as a standalone expressive MIDI controller, then I think it's actually pretty great value, because for about 300 quid you're getting a portable MIDI and CV controller which isn't just confined to USB, and which also supports MPE and Polyphonic Aftertouch with those delightfully squishy pads. To top things off, the harmonic tonal array style layout is really quite inspiring and fun to use, and the improvements that Intuitive Instruments have made with the latest firmware update demonstrate that they are actively listening and implementing meaningful changes based on user feedback, which I think is great and not to be taken for granted. If you're like me and appreciate experimenting with creative approaches to making music, then I think that this is probably worth taking a look at, particularly because of the price point. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. If you found this useful in any way and want to support me and the channel, then you can sign up to my Patreon below. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there, including all the music I make, stems for remix and sample packs and all that kind of stuff. But either way, I just appreciate that you're here. So, you know, feel free to help feed the algorithm by leaving a comment and all that jazz. Until next time, toodaloo.